in presidential election years. And yet, this election feels so personal to me because I'm now a mom. Even more so than just the fact that I'm so proud that my mom is running. Because I know that whomever we elect will play such a profound role in shaping the country and the world and really the future. That my children, that Matthew, the mayor's son, that all of our children and grandchildren will grow up in. The second reason I think that this is the most important presidential election of my lifetime is because I worry that everything I care most about is at risk at this moment in time. All the progress that President Obama has made, all the opportunities for further progress that his leadership has enabled, I worry all of that is at risk. So I just want to share a little bit about why I harbor that concern so deeply in my heart and why I so strongly believe my mom is the only candidate who can help us navigate forward. And then open it up to whatever questions or thoughts you may want to share, or if any of you have any particular memories of my mom or even this area that you want to share. It was actually really fun for me earlier today in Poughkeepsie to hear people talk about Rhinebeck, which has a very special place in my heart because that's where I got married. So shamelessly, I'm always looking for that, as well as I'm very happy to at least try to answer whatever questions may be on your hearts or on your minds. But just a few reasons about why I think this election is so crucial and why I so strongly support my mom. And the first area I want to talk about is healthcare. I remember back in 93 and 94, my mom fought really hard for universal healthcare coverage. And I also remember when her efforts didn't work out, rather infamously. And I think it's really healthy that she can now joke, as she did in the debate on Thursday night, that before it was called Obamacare, it was called Hillary Care. So I'm happy that she can joke about that, because it was a pretty brutal experience. For those of you that are my age or a little bit older, you may remember the Harry and Louise ads. For those of you that don't remember, Harry and Louise were an older couple that were sitting across a kitchen table from each other, and they would have a series of conversations about what would happen to them if my mom's healthcare plan took effect. And they were all very dire predictions. You know, they were going to lose their doctors, they were going to lose the ability to buy the medicines they needed, the hospitals nearby were going to close, and sort of the underlying theme of a lot of these was that if my mom's healthcare proposal were to prevail, they would die. It's a little bit dire, but not much. So I would have understood, given how kind of much of the tens of millions of dollars that the pharmaceutical and health insurance industry spent against her efforts was targeted at her personally. I would have understood if she said, oh, I'm just too tired. Like, I need to take a break from this. Maybe there'll be a more perfect day to wage this effort again. But I don't think I've ever heard my mom say I'm tired. And of all the things people have accused her of, even recently, I don't think anyone's ever accused her of being a quitter. And so she didn't quit, and she didn't say I'm tired. She said, well, what can I still do? Where can I still make progress? And she spent 3 years building a bipartisan coalition to create the Children's Health Insurance Program. And the Children's Health Insurance Program now insures more than 8 million low-income children across our country, including hundreds of thousands here in New York State. So to me, that's what real progress looks like. And the Children's Health Insurance Program is now a core part of the Affordable Care Act. And admittedly, I'm really tired of people saying the Affordable Care Act hasn't made a difference. We're at more than 90% healthcare coverage in our country, and here's just one example of what that historic achievement means. It means a lot to me as an expectant mom, this data point. In 2015, we had more pregnant women receive the full complement of prenatal health care services than at any point in American history. And we had deliver babies in safe environments, in hospitals, in birthing centers, with doctors, with trained midwives, than at any point in American history. So to me, that's an extraordinary achievement on behalf of women, families, our children, our future. So while we of course need to get to 100% coverage and lower costs throughout the system and really do a lot of what my mom was first advocating for back in 93 and 94, including empowering Medicare to negotiate with drug companies to bring down the costs of pharmaceuticals for both people on Medicare and people not on Medicare, we can't start over. We can't lose the gains that we've made. We can't put in jeopardy kind of all of the progress that the Affordable Care Act represents. And I think it should matter that my mom has really the only record of being able to solve problems, even sometimes with the most unlikely allies. Just kind of a few examples of what I mean by that, and her ability to not let kind of the perfect or the pure be the enemy of the good. She worked with a man named Tom DeLay. For those of you who don't know who Tom DeLay is, although given kind of the smiles many of you do, Tom DeLay, for those of you who don't know, sort of the godfather, or the grandfather is probably a nicer way to put it, of the Tea Party movement. And yet she worked with Congressman DeLay to overhaul adoption of the foster care system. And there now, in any given year, 60 to 80% more young people and children adopted out of the foster care system than there were 15 years ago. That, I think, is real progress. She worked with her then Senate colleague, Senator Schumer, as well as Senator Graham and others, to extend the VA system to include our National Guards men and women who have served our country overseas, so that when they come home, they and their families can take full advantage of every service of the VA system. I think it matters that someone knows how to solve problems and find common ground with even unlikely allies to be able to solve those problems. I also think it matters that we have a president who knows that we don't live in a single issue country. And I think we saw this again in the debate on Thursday night, for those of you who saw the debate. And I think we see this in many different aspects of the election, but in one place I think it's really clear is in conversations around the Supreme Court. And we saw this contrast again on the debate stage on Thursday. When my mom's Democratic opponent talks about the Supreme Court, he talks about it, as he did on Thursday night, as I've heard him do repeatedly, through the lens of campaign finance reform and the need to overturn Citizens United. Now, admittedly, as my mom's daughter, I always try to own my biases. So as my mom's daughter, and I'm very biased toward her, it's hard for me when anyone asserts that they care more about overturning Citizens United than my mom does, because for my mom it's ethical and personal. It's ethical because she knows we have to remove the perverse equations of money equals speech and corporation equals person that are codified in Citizens United. But it's also personal because Citizens United was an organization set up in 2007 with literally only one mission. Only one. To destroy my mom's 2008 presidential campaign. So for her, it's ethical and personal. She's deeply committed to overturning Citizens United, and that's probably an understatement. But she knows that the court sits at the crucible of so much else than campaign finance reform alone. And she knows we can't afford to have a president who views any part of the job as having only one central mission. And I think this is really clear when we look at the court. So just a few examples. In 2013, with Justice Scalia on the bench, the court overturned a core part of the Voting Rights Act. We're seeing the direct consequences of that decision in this election. We have more voter ID restrictions in 2016 than we've had at any point since before the Civil Rights Act. We have gone back more than 50 years in terms of voter enfranchisement in our country. We also kind of see the Supreme Court matter when we think about gun control. With Justice Scalia on the bench, the court had an uneven record on gun control. Sometimes it upheld local and state gun control measures as being compliant with the Second Amendment, and sometimes the court struck them down. So if you listen to Moms Demand Action and the Brady campaign, kind of some of the major efforts pushing for smart, sensible, meaningful, and enforceable gun control across our country, which in disclosure have endorsed my mom. They say they believe the next time the court rules on gun control, it'll rule definitively. To kind of clear up the inconsistency, it'll rule once and for all and say, this is what Second Amendment compliant gun control can look like in our country. So it matters to me that my mom is the only candidate running for president who has a consistently strong record on gun control and consistently makes the connection between what she would do from a legislative and an executive power standpoint on gun control, but also in thinking about a Supreme Court nominee. It's one of those issues I didn't know I could care more about until I became a parent. And I think every day about what we need to do on this. Another example, and one that my mom brought up in the debate on Thursday night when she said, of course, she would also ensure that any person she would nominate to the Supreme Court would be committed to overturning Citizens United. Equally, she would ensure that whomever she appointed was committed to recognizing that Roe v. Wade is established law in our country. And I think this is a not small point, partly because of what we saw the Supreme Court hear a few weeks ago, kind of in one of their first major hearings since Justice Scalia passed, when the Supreme Court heard a challenge to something called Texas Law HB 2. Now that sounds pretty innocuous, but it's far from it. Texas Law HB 2 radically restricts a woman's right to choose. Planned Parenthood says that if Texas Law HB 2 is allowed to stand, more than 25% of women in Texas will have fewer reproductive health care choices. But this is happening not only in Texas. Since 2010, we've had more than 300 laws passed at the local and state level restricting a woman's right to choose. In 2016, we have 300 more similar laws proposed restricting a woman's right to choose. Planned Parenthood says that by the end of 2016, if Texas Law HB 2 is allowed to stand, and the laws that it expects to pass are passed, more than 50% of American women will have fewer reproductive health care choices than we had in 2010. This is not a small issue. So I find it very challenging when my mom's Democratic opponent sometimes dismisses, as he has, women's issues as being a distraction. Because to me, our right to choose is a fundamental human right. It is not only about our reproductive health, it's about our entire health and our agency, but it's also another issue of equity, because wealthier women in our country have always had choices. Just the last example of why I think the Supreme Court is so important, although I could talk about this for probably longer than any of you would want to sit or stand here, is that we're seeing what's happening in Mississippi and North Carolina with a regression of equal rights. And although Mississippi and North Carolina have received a lot of attention, similar to Texas Law HB 2, they're not alone in not kind of moving forward or moving backward in the fight for equal rights. There are now 31 states where it is legal to discriminate against someone on the basis of perceived gender identity or sexual orientation. Discriminate against people in service, employment, education, healthcare, and housing. Some of those laws are currently being challenged, and some of those challenges are expected to reach the court probably in the autumn of 2017. So it matters to me that when my mom has kind of more time than allotted on the debate stage, when she talked about women's rights, she also talks about equal rights, that she talks about gun control, that she talks about voting rights, and so much else that the Supreme Court is sitting in the crucible of. Because while I had no idea when I joined my mom's campaign that the court would be thrust into the center spotlight that it has been with Justice Scalia's passing, and I certainly hope the Senate does indeed do its job. It's my favorite hashtag at the moment, do its job or do your job, directed at the Senate. Even if the Senate does its job and gives President Obama's nominee, Judge Garland, a full and fair hearing, this is a relevant question in this election. Because if you look at the average age on the Supreme Court and the average age at which justices historically have retired, the next president will appoint an additional 1, 2, or even 3 justices to the Supreme Court, shaping the court for generations to come. Just the last point I want to make relates to our values. I never thought that I would see in my lifetime the almost normalization of hate speech coming out of the Republican side. And I hope that none of us ever become desensitized to it or accept it for the normalization that clearly is now seemingly taken for granted in the Republican rhetoric. The racism, the sexism, the Islamophobia, the homophobia, the anti-immigrant rhetoric, the anti-workers' rights rhetoric, the rhetoric against Americans with disabilities. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. And then the policy proposals or realities that flow from that to build a wall around our country, to keep a list of every American Muslim, to have discriminatory, targeted policing of American Muslim neighborhoods, to make the laws that we're seeing in North Carolina and Mississippi the law of the land. I mean, none of this is what I think probably we want to see in our country, and it's certainly not representative of the country that I want my children to grow up in. So I think that it matters that we have a president who knows how to make government work on behalf of our values, when in office and also when not in office. So I think one of those points that sometimes is dismissed as being not particularly important or not particularly sexy, but I would argue is really important. And I think is another area where my mom is the only person running who has an actual record of having been able to do this. So just 2 examples from kind of opposite ends of her political, I lost the mic, but it came back, thankfully. When she was First Lady of Arkansas, my mom started the first public early childhood education program ever in Arkansas, a program called HIPPY, so it's a pretty easy name to remember. It's a program that actually now exists in parts of New York State. It's a program that exists in 26 states across the country. She started the first American program of HIPPY in Arkansas, launched in 1986. And there now have been more than 1 million children who've gone through this program in the 30 years since its inception. When she started HIPPY in Arkansas, she knew she needed Democratic and Republican support. She also knew that she needed teacher and parent support, and she knew she needed civil society and religious support, both to ensure that the program actually was going to be responsive to what families wanted in terms of education and empowerment for their youngest children, but also to ensure that it would be more likely to be sustained into the future. And we see now why that really mattered, because unlike in 1986, Arkansas now has an incredibly conservative Republican governor and an incredibly conservative Republican state legislature who have been cutting public funding for higher education, for public education, for many public programs. But they haven't cut the funding for HIPPY, and they haven't cut the funding for early childhood education. And I think that's a real testament to how my mom built a strong and deep coalition of support for HIPPY and then continued to support and champion HIPPY kind of in the years since. When she was Secretary of State, she created the first high-level position for someone to monitor on behalf of the US government how girls and women are treated around the world. And she made clear that how countries treated girls and women was going to impact how we treated them. And she expected all of our embassies around the world to regularly report on things like women's rights and girls' education and gender-based violence. And I think it's important to note that Secretary Kerry's continued that, partly because it's important that a man, in total candor, has continued to make it clear that how women are treated is an American foreign policy priority. But it's also important because it'll be harder for someone to dismantle that later. She created the first high-level position for someone to monitor on behalf of the US government how the LGBT community is treated around the world. And she helped create the very first fast-track asylum process ever, so that sadly when, but not if, LGBT activists and advocates are being persecuted or even prosecuted in their home countries, they can quickly apply for asylum and get to safety here in the United States. It's important that Secretary Kerry's continued that, but I think it's really important now to recognize that for the thousands of Foreign Service officers around the world who work on our behalf every day, they now think that this is part of their job. So it'll be hard if, and I hope we don't, but if we have a Republican president and a Republican Secretary of State to tell the Foreign Service that all of a sudden we don't care about how girls and women are treated, or we don't care about how the LGBT community is treated. It'll be hard to take down whole processes and offices that have been established. It matters that someone knows how to actually make government work on behalf of our values, when in office and when out of office. So clearly I'm very passionate about my mom's campaign. I've already acknowledged at least twice that I'm deeply biased toward my mother. I'm very proud to be her daughter. I hope that my children feel toward me someday the way that I feel toward my mom. I couldn't imagine a better grandmother for my children. Admittedly, my daughter calls my mom grandma because she can't quite get a D yet, so it's just grandma. But I also couldn't imagine a better president for my children or for any of our children. So I just want to thank you all again. And I'm happy to try to answer any questions, or I'm open to hearing suggestions or memories. And I see some children in the audience, so I want to say you don't have to be old enough to vote to ask a question. In fact, I would love it if some of the kids wanted to ask questions. So yes, sir, I saw your hand first in the back.
I've got a question. Are you concerned at all when your mother wins the nomination that it's going to be hard to bring the Democratic Party as a whole back together to go up against the Republicans in November?
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm going to work really hard for that outcome. I don't take anything for granted. I would say a few things. I certainly hope that all Democrats recognize how much more we have in common than we do with whomever the Republican nominee will be. I think that's quite evident when we look at Mr. Trump, but Senator Cruz is equally, if not more, conservative in some areas. And Governor Kasich, I think, sometimes looks moderate by comparison, but on equal rights, on women's rights, and on so much else that I think is core to our values is also equally conservative. And the second kind of thing I would mention is my mom fought really hard in 2008 in the Democratic primary. And then when she lost to now President Obama, she fought just as hard to elect President Obama and unify the party and bring the 18 million people who had voted to her to support President Obama in November. So I think we do have a recent history of having strongly contested primaries and then very much being able to unify. And as my mom has said throughout this campaign, even if people aren't standing with her right now, she's always stood for our shared common values, and she hopes that people will recognize that. Yeah, thank you. Oh gosh. Yes, ma'am, I think I saw your hand next.
When is she going to announce the lineup?
Oh my gosh, man, we have a long way to go until then, but thank you. This is so, well, I've never had that conversation with my mom. I mean, she asked when my mom would announce her running mate, and I said we have a long way to go. We don't take anything for granted. You heard Liam talk about all of the phone banking and canvassing that's going to be happening kind of all day today, tomorrow, and Tuesday. We're going to work as hard as we can for every vote here in New York, and then kind of in every primary that comes next Tuesday. So I've never heard my mom even talk about that because I just don't think that we're there, although I certainly hope that we will be there. And I have no doubt that if we are, my mom will make a strong choice, but I have no more insight to that question than you might have because I've literally not thought about it until you just asked it. Yes, right there. Yes, little one. Will you tell me your name and tell me how old you are?
Tiger Lily.
You're Tiger Lily, and how old are you, Tiger Lily?
5.
You're 5, so are you in kindergarten?
Not yet.
Not yet, you're in pre-kindergarten.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
We want Hillary to be the first girl president.
Thank you. Thank you, Tiger Lily. I also want Hillary to be the first girl president. And Tiger Lily, I hope that you'll go with your mom to vote on Tuesday. Great, thank you. Yes.
If your mom is...
Will you tell me your name too? Tell me how old you are.
My name is Mark, I'm 12. My question is, if your mother is elected president, how do you think being in the White House will be different from when it was back in '93?
Well, for me, I'm in a very different point in my life now, as I also gesture to my belly. When my father was elected in '92 and we moved into the White House in January of 1993, I was 12. And so, for me, the kind of biggest changes now are that I'm now a mom. And I'm married. I got married across the way. I like apparently talking about that as much as possible because I'm feeling quite nostalgic being in this part of the world. And you know, my life is in New York now. I work with the Clinton Foundation. I teach at Columbia University. That's clearly in New York. My husband's work is in New York, and so I certainly hope that my mother will be moving, but I'll be in New York. Although my grandmother, my mom's mom, I was very close to my grandmother. She passed away when she was 92. She passed away about 4.5 years ago. And she lived in Washington. I spoke to her every day, and I tried to see her every other weekend. My husband jokes that he knew that we might be able to work out if my parents didn't approve, but if my grandmother hadn't approved, there was just no way that we would have ever made it kind of down the aisle. So that shows just how important she was to my life and my heart. And so it is possible to kind of go back and forth often, and I hope to be able to do that. But again, we have a lot of work to do between now and next January. Yeah, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. As an old activist and retired child welfare worker, I am for Hillary for so many reasons. But the one most personal to me is obviously a woman of my age who worked all of my life. My whole life also is filled with you can't do. And women are making incredible gains since I was a child. But for every step forward, there's a strong pushback and sometimes a brutal strong pushback. So I want to say, as someone who had the privilege of working for Shirley Chisholm way back in the day, but we knew she didn't have a prayer, to see such a progressive woman in my lifetime on the cusp of becoming president, that is a revolution I can buy into.
Thank you for what you said and what you've shared, and thank you for also effectively acknowledging that there is still sexism in our country, as uncomfortable as that may make us. Just as there is clearly still racism and homophobia and Islamophobia and anti-worker sentiments and so much else that I wish weren't a reality, but I think we have to acknowledge. And kind of just one kind of bit of context to that relating to gender, the most recent kind of broad-based survey that was done in 2014 by Pew Research, clearly an expectation of my mom running for president, asked people, would you support the most qualified candidate, however you would define that, regardless of gender? And 91% of people said yes. So either you can view that as, wow, like 91% of people said yes, or 9% of people said no, representing tens of millions of Americans who still would not vote for a woman president. And I think, again, we saw in some of the social media around the debate on Thursday night, where people were online talking about my mother's voice, or her hair, or her outfit. And you can either think, oh, that's just sort of funny, or you can recognize kind of that for exposing still kind of at best implicit and at worst, still explicit sexism in our country. So I think it's really important that you keep telling your story and kind of why your story is my mom's story and is our American story for women in many ways. So thank you. Yes. So tell me your name and tell me how old you are.
10 years old. I'm 10 years old, and as you get older, would you think of running for president like your mom and your dad?
Well, Joseph, thank you for asking your question. Probably not surprisingly, I've been asked this before. I think the first time I remember being asked this, I was actually younger than you, or asked a variation of this. I remember waving an American flag on the side of one of my dad's political rallies, and this woman coming up to me and saying, Chelsea, do you think you would want to grow up and run for governor of Arkansas one day? And I think I said something like, ma'am, I'm 3 or 4. And yet I think it's been a real gift that I've been asked that question. And I think it's a question, Joseph, that people should be asking you if you're really interested in changing your community or our state, our country, our world. Because who runs for political office at every level of government really matters. And so for me right now, the answer to your question is no. But I want to tell you kind of why it's no, in case it's helpful to you as you think about this, or hopefully as maybe your parents, your grandparents, your teachers ask you this question, and as you ask your friends this question. I think the first question to think about in the context of public office is, do you think that your values, your family, what you want to see in the future is being well represented? And for me right now, the answer to that question is yes. I really like my city councilwoman in New York City. I think she does a great job on behalf of our neighborhood. I really like our public advocate in New York City. I think she does a great job on behalf of our city. Someone just said she's great, I agree. Tish James, I think, does a great job. I really like our mayor. I really like my congresswoman. I really like my 2 senators. I'm clearly a big fan of President Obama's, and I'm clearly a big fan of my mom, who's running to succeed President Obama. So for me, right now, I think my values and what I hope to see for my future, and most importantly, the future of my family, is being well represented. But if at any point that were to change, if my city councilwoman were to step down, if my congresswoman were to step down, and I had a vision for what I would do with that job, and I thought I had the right skills and experience to be able to realize that vision, I then would have to ask and answer, do I now think it makes sense to run for public office? And I make the point about kind of having the right vision and experience for a given job, because I think what we're seeing in this election is that a lot of people don't always understand what's possible and not possible for a president to do. And I think we see this when Mr. Trump says things like, when I'm president, Speaker Ryan is just going to have to listen to me and do what I say. Like, well, no, the Speaker of the House, actually Congress broadly, doesn't work for the president. Or both Mr. Trump and Senator Sanders at times have referred to my Supreme Court. While the president has the responsibility and the privilege of making appointments to the Supreme Court, presuming the Senate does its job and gives that person a full, fair hearing and then a vote. It's not actually a president's Supreme Court. I think one of the geniuses of our country is that we have a checks and balance system. Or I think we see it sometimes in what various candidates say about kind of expecting states to do. I think we see this in Senator Sanders' free college plan, which, although somewhat depends on a Wall Street speculation tax, also significantly depends on states coming up with billions of dollars day one to finance his proposal. So even though I think 48 of 50 states have cut funding for public education in the last couple of years. And governors don't work for the president in the same way that Congress doesn't work for the president. So I say that because I think it's really important. You know, Joseph, if you care about recycling, for example, then you should probably run when you're a little bit older to be mayor or to be county executive, because they have a lot more authority over what happens in recycling than the president does. I'm sure that the president and Mrs. Obama and Sasha Malia are really diligent recyclers in the White House, so they can lead by example. But the president doesn't have a lot of authority or the ability to really influence kind of whether you recycle here in Ulster County. So I hope that you will think about these questions, and I hope that you'll ask your friends these questions and not just think these questions should be relevant to someone whose last name is Clinton. And that it really matters who runs not only for president, but mayor and county executive and everything in between. Yes, ma'am.
Your mother will win the primary for district.
My big concern is, having lived through Gore and Bush, that the Republicans will find a way to steal, corrupt the national election. That's very concerning, and I don't know what we can do other than get out huge, huge numbers of popular vote.
Well, I certainly think you raise a larger question that is receiving now, once again, attention, which is that it should be much easier to vote in our country. And that we should have much more easily verifiable and audible trails of how we vote individually as well as a community. There are about a third of the states in our country that use voting machines, and we don't have good data, but that are at least 10, probably 15 years or older. And those are often expected to kind of talk to much more more recent vintage and newer computer systems. So there are lots of technological and technical challenges. So we need to have clear federal standards about kind of what voting should look like, not just could look like, but should look like and must look like, in terms of everything from early voting to when polls are open, to the ratio of polling stations to people in a given community, to the technical standards. And the last point that I would make, kind of in line with this, is I think it's really important, and I'm grateful that my mom has been an early and vocal advocate of this, and that this is now the Democratic Party's position of universal voter registration at 18. Because I think if you kind of watch the news, there's this perception that kind of every young person is voting. But we think about 55% of 18 to 24-year-olds are registered to vote. And in almost every contest, even the majority of the young people registered to vote haven't shown up to vote. So I think it's really important that we get to universal registration, in part because whether or not someone's registered is the greatest predictor of whether or not they'll vote. And that may sound obvious, but again, if you kind of watch the news, there's lots of coverage about the weather on election day. And the weather on election day is not unimportant, but truly the greatest predictor of whether someone votes is whether or not they're registered before election day. Because even in states with same-day registration, it's really if someone is registered and already expect themselves to go vote that makes a difference. So automatically registering 18-year-olds, I think, would say we're valuing your vote, we're validating your vote, we're expecting you to vote and to participate, and hopefully then would exert an even stronger pressure, if at that point necessary, to ensure that we have clear voting guidelines that actually enable everyone to know that our vote has been counted and our voice has been heard. And surely if until the 1970s we sent draft cards to every young man when he turned 18 in our country, we can figure out in 2016 how to automatically enroll everyone. That doesn't seem like such a stretch to me. So I know we're out of time. I just want to say again, thank you all for coming. I'm so excited so many people who aren't old enough yet to vote ask questions. I hope that all of you will talk to anyone you've ever even met about what's at stake in this election. I hope today was helpful and when you have those conversations. And I hope on Tuesday you'll equally bring everyone you've ever even met with you to the polls. I just want to end by once again thanking Liam and my mom's amazing team here in Ulster and everyone who's already working and will work on behalf of our campaign. So thank you all very much.